Good afternoon and welcome to episode 6. Oh my gosh, I can't believe we're already this far in the season of season 3 of Black Writers Read. My name is Nicole Young Martin and I serve as your founder, producer, and host for the series. And I'm coming to you actually from a different location. I am in New York City, specifically the Flatiron District. I'm in my hotel room. I was here over the weekend for a conference and the New York Comedy Festival. I have a dear friend who's doing a live podcast recording this evening, and that's what I'm here for. And I'm only here until tomorrow, but I've had an amazing time doing a lot of great things. Check me out on Instagram for all of the things that I've been doing over the past couple of days here in New York City. Black Writers Read showcases, celebrates, and honors the words, work, and traditions of Black writers from across the country, across genres, across experiences, and across the African diaspora. Black Writers Read is a behind the scenes conversation into the craft and what it means to create as a Black author in today's society. Since starting the series during the summer of 2020, we've hosted over 40 authors representing various genres, including children's books, young adult fiction, poetry, urban creative nonfiction, memoir, history, horror, essays, food, and culture from around the globe, including Western Massachusetts, Maryland, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., upstate New York, New York's Hudson Valley, Vermont, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Chicago, Virginia, Seattle, Washington, Portugal, and Jacksonville, Florida. Today, we welcome Dr. Natasha Gordon-Chipembere, who is joining us from Heredia, Costa Rica. Yes, I have added South America to this list. I'm super excited. We're going to be talking with her today about her historical fiction novel, Finding La Negrita, which was released in September. Published by Jaded Ibis Press, Finding La Negrita is a captivating retelling of the Black Madonna narrative, which has driven Costa Rica's national and spiritual identity since the 1700s. In powerful prose, Natasha delivers a vivid and intimate living portrait of slavery in the nation, which was radically different from plantation bondage in other parts of the Americas, especially here in the United States. Natasha is a professor of African diasporic literature. She focused her first book on Sarah Bartman in representation in Black womanhood, the legacy of Sarah Bartman, which was published by Palgrave in 2011. Her writing has also been published in Essence magazine, along with a monthly series, Musing from an Afro Costa Rican in the Tico Times. She is a senior editor of the Afro Latina Diaspora's book series for Palgrave, which prioritizes the voices of emerging Afro Latino Latina scholars. Her current writing focuses on slavery and the legacy of Afro descendants in Latin America. Her historical fiction novel, which we'll be talking about today, was published by Jaded Ibis Press in September of 2022. Natasha is the founder and host of the annual Tingo Side writing retreats in Costa Rica, which we talked a little bit about an upcoming project from those writers, an exclusive gathering of global BIPOC writers in Costa Rica for a week. She was born in New York to Costa Rican Panamanian parents and eventually moved to Costa Rica 8 years ago with her husband and two children. Natasha is currently working on her next historical fiction novel, Naomi, which is a loose rendering of her great grandmother's life in Puerto Limon, Costa Rica in the 1940s. To learn more about Natasha and her work, please visit her website at www.natashagordonchipembere.com. That is her first name, Natasha, last name Gordonchipembere.com. I will be sharing both her Instagram handle and web address during the show today. This episode is presented in collaboration with Lisa Pegram and Levee Break Lit. Thank you so much to Lisa and Levee Break Lit for your ongoing support of Black Writers Read, which, by the way, Lisa will be our guest on January 21st. So be sure to join us here as you will be hearing from such an amazing poet and storyteller. I cannot wait to finally have her on as a Black Writers Read guest. I am extremely excited to have Natasha on today. I look up to her so much and absolutely love how expansive her writing is. Of course, I give all my guests flowers, tons of them, gardens. She's written for academia and pop culture, two very distinctly different yet very important audiences. I admire authors who engage with these audiences. It can be a challenge to do both really well and be respected for it. Natasha's writing for both spheres is so intentional. So please make sure to look up her work, especially in Essence Magazine. For those of you who are new to Black Writers Read, here is the format of our show. First, Natasha will read an excerpt from her book, Finding La Negrita. Then we'll chat about her work. Afterwards, we'll engage in a conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A to all of our viewers if questions come through. We have viewers joining us from both Facebook and YouTube today. If you have a question, please feel free to include it in the comment section on the platform where you're joining us today. I will compile the questions and pose them to Natasha at the end if we have some. So now I like to invite Natasha to the virtual stage. Hello.
Hello, hello. Good afternoon from Costa Rica.
I know. Are you in Eastern time zone?
I am not. I think I'm 1 hour behind Eastern because of the time difference now.
Oh, wow. Nice. So I'm going to turn it over to you to read and have lots of fun.
Yes, thank you. I was originally going to read the prologue, but I've decided that I want to read a chapter from one of the characters that I really love, from Esmeralda. This is the book Finding La Negrita. And La Negrita is the Black Madonna in Costa Rica and the patron saint of Costa Rica. And that's what she's called here, La Negrita, the little black one. Esmeralda. My name is Esmeralda. It is only at this time in the morning, when the first birds are remembering the sounds of their voices, calling to the sun to warm their wings after a night of nestled perching, that I can stand outside. I am 51 years old, as far as I have been able to count, which I learned only after being given to the church. I've always been owned by one form of oppression or another. As an enslaved person, my life is one of interiors. I cleaned the church for Padre, and I lived tucked away in a shack behind the looming gravity of stained glass and burnt candle stubs. Today, I stand in my doorway, edged slightly against the frame, so if anyone were to pass, they would have to look twice to see me. Instead of staring up into the fleeting night sky and seeing the shadow of Volcano Irasu, I look down at my shriveled left arm, hanging aimlessly against my thin green dress, its color lost years ago with constant washing. It is hard to see the width of this place around me as my left eye remains glassy and visionless. I do not think back to the fire, but shrug off those memories that want to take over. I have been in this place, Costa Rica, for my entire life, but came here to Cartago at the age of 16 when my mother and brother died and I was gifted to the church. 35 years have passed, and I serve as witness, now with one eye, to the comings and goings of this very different place. I do not remember the land beyond the sea that many speak about in La Gotera, and I force myself not to take on their longing. Guatemala is the center of the universe in this place of mountains and volcanoes, and trees thick with arms that stretch into the nocturnal homes of hundreds of birds. The air is chilled this morning. Padre has yet to stir, though at times I have been called to light candles in the small chapel alongside the altar this early in the morning, when he is woken from a restless sleep and prayer is possibly his medicine. I don't know, and I don't care about the things that move his world. I only care when his world collides with mine. Today, I think about this town that feels forgotten from the rest of the world. The labor of my enslaved brothers and sisters is shared alongside their owners in the cacao farms and cattle ranching to provide the meat which is cooked by enslaved hands at the table of the pañas in town. I hear them discussing how, without a cash plantation crop, they are unable to compete with the silver mines or sugarcane plantations of Brazil. Our numbers are relatively small, and that is why several have been able to hire themselves out and, over time, eventually buy their freedom. I have seen Dakarai do it, 7 years owned and working for all those extra Sundays, where he saved every real until he could remove the bitterness of slavery from his tongue and become reunited with his daughter, Jendai. Some, like myself, do not have the fortune of skills that they can manipulate towards freedom. I am a slave of the church, and I know this is how I will die. With my one working eye and arm, it is much more difficult to do the cleaning. Yet Jendai delivers water to the church before attending school here with the other children who are free blacks under Padre's guidance. Costa Rica is nestled between two wide oceans, I am told. It does not offer much, and so we are poor and huddled in the confines of the Orosi Valley, pretending that the Spaniards here are not forced to labor among their enslaved workers in order to pay the tax to the Gran Audiencia in Guatemala. The details are hard to work out, but I know there is not enough money to create certain distances between those who are free and owned. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the prologue. And this takes us into our questions. So, first question that I have for you, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So, not only do I like to talk with authors about the text that is read, but also talk about the breadth of their work. So, the first question I have for you is, as does people's names, book titles have power and serve as an introduction to their existence? Can you talk about how you came up with the title Finding La Negrita and why the word finding holds so much prominence in the title?
Thank you. So, as I mentioned when I was reading the chapter, La Negrita is the local name in Costa Rica to for the Black Madonna. So there is a Black Madonna in Costa Rica. In the Catholic Church, she's called La Virgen de los Ángeles, and she's housed in the Basilica, which is the biggest church in Costa Rica. But originally she was called La Negrita, and today most people will still identify her as La Negrita, the little black one, because her statue, the icon, is a black stone icon that's quite small, probably about maybe the length of my pointer finger. But when I was thinking about the title, I knew I wanted to have her name, the Black Madonna's name, and how it was understood locally in Costa Rica in the title. And then I thought about the word finding. And for me, finding is the idea around journey. And so that's what this entire book is about. It is about journeying to find freedom, journeying to love, um, journeying for safety, journeying in terms of finding identity, journeying between the seas and different homelands, journeying to find a space of safety and a space of place. And so for me, that's what I want the readers to also understand, that they're going on a journey with me and these characters, right? And so they're going to journey to find this Black Madonna.
Nice. And I love that it's I'm gonna hold that question. I'm gonna hold that question. But I love that it is the finding the journey home and the finding the identity was one of the questions that I am posing later. And I sent Natasha the questions earlier, talks about the uniqueness of this particular narrative and the ways in which these characters are rendered in this particular time period. And in comparison, at least to texts written by African American authors in like retelling slavery, with the exception of like Octavia Butler and Toni Morrison. The next question I have is What is the book's origin story? I believe that you were called to write this story, given your ancestry. Why now in this part of your career? And can you also talk about how long it took you to write this book? Because I had a chance to read that, and I was like reading the process. I was like, wow.
Ooh, that's a great question. So, um, 7 years.
Wow.
It took me 7 years. I would say 5 active years of research. So originally, I would say the origin story comes kind of from a conversation or conversations that I had with my mother. My mother's Costa Rican, and she was raised in Costa Rica, educated in Costa Rica, even though she's a retired Spanish professor now and has lived X amount of years in the United States.
Oh.
However, one of the things I was really interested in is sort of we were having these conversations because I do my work on slavery, and we were having these conversations, and she sort of said, "Well, no, there was no slavery in Costa Rica," and I was just like, "Well, how does that work?" Costa Rica had over 200 years of slavery,
Right.
and it wasn't part of the national narrative. It wasn't part of conversations in the educational materials and curriculum. It was very much sort of, that one little paragraph, and then everybody who was enslaved kind of melted into the bloodstream, and everybody became Costa Rican, right? And
Mm.
so that's very much part of the narrative that we're this sort of homogeneous, um, tico. The Costa Rican is this hardworking kind of peasant, kind of Catholic, very family oriented person. And a lot of those things are true, but in terms of it being homogeneous, no, that is not the case. Costa Rica did not have a slave port, right? Most of the enslaved people who
Oh.
came through Portobello, which is in the south, which is in Panama, right? And so many
Oh.
of them were sort of smuggled along the coast and were brought into the colonial capital of Cartago, in the Central Valley, right? Over a 200-year time period, right? And so slavery ends in 1824 in Costa Rica, even though they had gained their independence by 1821. And
Mm.
so for me, I was just like, well, how does Costa Rica reconcile sort of presenting itself as the Switzerland of Central America and this country that doesn't have an army and sort of this very homogeneous, sort of white presenting country, right? Even though obviously it's mestizo, everybody's mixed up. If you actually did any of the ancestry bloodline tests, everybody's mixed. Um, and then sort of have this one identity that it's really presenting to the world, but then 90% of the country is Catholic and venerates a Black Madonna, right? I was just like, so
Mm.
how do we put these pieces together? So originally I started to do work because I was thinking about writing this as an academic, right? So I went to the British archive, I
Oh.
went to the British Library and went into the archives. I came to Costa Rica and you worked at the National Library and then the National Archives. And then one day in the National Archives in Costa Rica, I actually found a ledger because people were meticulous, right? And so I found a ledger of Spaniards who eventually became Costa Ricans, colonists, who essentially documented their holdings, their ownings, right? And there was the list of, X amount of cattle, X amount of horses, X amount of slaves. And so for me, that really confirmed in the archive what I had been sensing all along, but it really confirmed that, people were being owned in multiple capacities. And so, it was mostly domestic work and mostly women, enslaved women who worked in the domestic space. And then there was cattle ranching in the West. And then there was cacao farming, which is obviously the origins of chocolate, cacao farming in more of the Caribbean coast. But what's interesting is that Costa Rica, because of the terrain, never had a cash crop. And because it didn't have a cash
Oh.
crop, it didn't have traditional plantation slavery where you're thinking about like, the slave house and then all of the
Right.
levels of field workers and the domestic workers and sort of that insular world. That's not what happened in Costa Rica. And so what was also interesting is that because Costa Rica was so poor and they didn't have a cash crop, many of the Spaniards could not afford to keep enslaved people. It was too expensive to feed and house them. And so
Wow.
what they did was there was sort of this area called La Gotera, which literally means the leak or the drop,
Mm.
um, that was sort of adjacent to the center of town. that became kind of like a township, a black township. So free blacks would live, and mixed race people would live in that space, and then they would work in the, in the town center. They would be compensated, but they were free. But there was like curfews and everything like that, so they had to be back in that space. So the only people who really spent the night in the colonial capital were people who were enslaved. And so what I wanted to do was really talk about sort of who were these people that were free, because you never really hear narratives when you're thinking about slavery,
Yep.
the encounter, right? You never really hear, well, there's a whole free black population, and they had to negotiate those freedoms, right? And they had to engage with other enslaved people. They had to engage with, Spanish colonists, but they had a space of freedom. And I wanted to really think about, well, how that would work. And then I realized, well, the only way that you could really do that properly is through historical fiction, right? And
Oh,
so because I had certain facts, so yes, I mean, I spent years and years, you know, accurately describing the houses and the food processes and the market space and what people wore and what the church looked like, because those are there. I mean, there's authentic things. I mean, there are maps and drawings, which I studied. I've been to Cartago several times. I've walked the space, like I've physically been in the
wow.
space. But then I thought, like, well, how do I tell the story of these people and then their relationship to the icon? Which, so the book starts in 1634 in colonial Cartago, and in 1635, she is the icon. La Negrita is officially found, and then the church creates veneration and a church around her. And so
Wow.
that's sort of the origin story for me. I just felt like historical fiction was the only way to accurately build on real facts, but then envision, because it doesn't exist, those voices don't exist in the archive in terms of free black people. So even though I read Esmeralda's part, and she's an enslaved person owned by the church, and the Catholic Church, please note, was one of the largest owners of slaves, right? Right. And so I needed to put that in because it was accurate.
Mhm.
Right. And so I really wanted to just make sense of the relationship between freedom and enslaved people and the Spanish, but also show this whole other world that people have never really engaged with. When they think about slavery, they think about the plantation system. They think
Yes.
about,
The
sort of
United
the,
States plantation system.
exactly,
That's
exactly.
specific. Yes.
Exactly. So that's the origin story.
Wow. You just gave me like tons of history. Like one of the things, now I'm thinking about it, understanding, because historical fiction is a newer genre for me. And understanding, because I'm like, why don't people just write about history? But then not only are there so many gaps in history because of what's been kept in the archive, which, by the way, the Juneteenth episode of Black Writers Read, I will be speaking with archivists, and to talk about collaborating with archive, because I've had other historians on this past season. But not only is there gaps in knowledge and like stories archived, but then you have to think about the stories that are archived and the stories that are made available. And I know for myself, as someone who is African American and who went to school in the United States, and the things that I was taught, like going back to this, essentially to wrap up how I was taught about, those who were enslaved, the series Roots is the best example. It's like,
Exactly.
the passivity, the lack of agency, and all of these things, and like the lack of joy. And I love that historical fiction opens up the possibilities of bringing humanity to people of those particular time periods.
Mhm. That was essentially it. This is a love story.
Yeah.
More than anything else, it's a love story, but a love story on multiple dimensions. It's not just love of, it's not romantic love only. There's romantic
Exactly.
love, there's intimacy, but there's a different kind of love, love for voice, love for place, love for community, love, father-daughter love, right? Where,
Yeah.
and just elder and respect and love for elders. So that was really important for me.
Mhm. Yeah. My next question. Finding La Negrita is a historical fiction retelling story of the Black Madonna set in 17th century Costa Rica. Being that you have ancestral ties to Costa Rica, you talked a little bit about this. What does it mean to you to write this story? And I read your article in the Tico Times that writing this book for you was about coming home. What did you discover about yourself when conducting the research to devise the narrative?
That's a really good question. Thank you. Excuse me. Um, so one of the things that my husband's a professional musician, and we met in South Africa almost 26 years ago. So it's a long journey. We've
Wow.
traveled, and yes,
Mm.
one of the things in thinking about moving to Costa Rica and moving our children from Brooklyn, we were well established as a professor there. He was a sound engineer for the Brooklyn Museum of Art.
Oh,
Um, my
wow.
children were in a great, great school, a great private Quaker school in Brooklyn. And so we sort of had a community, but in thinking about moving to Costa Rica, and my husband has been coming to Costa Rica, since our children were small. He's always come, but usually it was always like holidays. We're going for Christmas, or and
Mm.
obviously we'd go with our children because I have a very large family here, and it's radically different than thinking about moving, right? And living full time and going to the grocery store and starting an electricity bill and doing all that. And so in thinking about moving to Costa Rica, which was the best decision of our lives, by the way, our children are fully bilingual and have lived an incredibly beautiful childhood, which is what we wanted to ensure for them as Black people in the world.
Mhm.
Um, so that was the intentionality around moving. It was around the safety of our children, and we were just right at the end of the Obama presidency, second, and we knew what was coming because we are readers of history.
Yep.
And so, in thinking about that, so that was the first priority, right? Going to a country that we already had a family base and that didn't have an army, and our kids could get immersed in the language. And that was a good decision. But the second decision was about being more intentional and focused on being creative, right? And so being an active agent, not just thinking, because I was a university professor, so that grind, right? I mean, you're
Yes.
grading papers, I'm teaching writing, I'm teaching literature, all that. I mean, it's a grind, and all the commitments for committee work, et cetera. That's what academia is like. And so I really wanted to write, and that was what Costa Rica offered for me. So I think in terms of learning about myself,
Mhm.
before I, in terms of the many introductions, because a lot of people will say, oh, okay, you're a professor and whatever. For me, the best introduction, the one that feels like the proper skin,
Yes.
is saying that I'm a writer, and I've never written fiction before. I've never.
Really?
This is my first attempt. I mean, and literally, I would say like
Oh.
80% of the manuscript as I wrote it in the first draft is essentially how it is. But I've been teaching literature for 25 years. I've been teaching
Oh.
writing for that long. And so even though I don't have an MFA, I mean, I have two masters in
Mhm.
in other things, but I don't have like a formal skill and training in terms of the craft of it. I teach it, but I have
Mhm.
never been taught it formally myself. And so I need to acknowledge
Wow.
that. But I am also a massive consumer of historical fiction. Like I
Nice.
love it. I read it all the time. Um, and so I guess for myself, what I learned about myself is that I really like the identity of being a writer. And I think I have a couple more books
Yay.
inside of me. And one of the things that I wanted to do when I was thinking about my life in Costa Rica, beyond being creative, beyond writing, was I wanted to serve as a bridge in some ways, right? So the way that it works is that my family, I'm the fourth generation person, Costa Rican person here in my family. And but my people came as immigrants at the turn of the 19th century from Jamaica. So they're Afro-Caribbean in
Wow.
origin, right? These were not my family did not come from the original enslaved people that had been here in the
Wow.
17th century. However, what I noticed is that that world of the Caribbean coast, and where my mother grew up and my grandmother and my great grandmother grew up was a very Jamaican sort of former British colony, and had worked around the United Fruit Company, and there was a whole sensibility, and that's the next book, by the way. Um,
Nice.
but they did not know about the 200 years of slavery. It wasn't part of their worldview. I mean, they could tell you about the Queen of England, right? But they wouldn't necessarily know about the Black Madonna because one, they weren't Catholics; these are Jamaicans, right? They were from the
Oh.
Church of England, or they were Methodist and Baptist, most of them Baptist. And so their worlds were totally separate. And so there was the Central Valley with Costa Ricans who were venerating the Black Madonna. And then you had the Caribbean coast, and they were worlds apart. The Caribbean coast folks were sort of Atlantic facing, right? They were engaging with ships that were coming from Europe and the United States, and they had a different sensibility. And so for me, I was just like, what I wanted to do was put those different layers and waves of Black migration into conversation with each other, right? And so that's why I started with this particular story, because the next story is going to be about Limon and the Caribbean coast, and sort of a light rendering of my great grandmother's story and how she migrated in 1910 from Jamaica, right? And what that world was like, but they have never actually been in conversation before. And so that's what I want to do. So I'm not a historian, but I love history. I'm definitely an Africanist, but my degree is in English, right? And so I'm a
Oh.
literature person. And so I'm using text as a way to then put those conversations together. And so that's kind of
Nice.
what I learned about history and myself.
Nice. So since you are an avid reader, this is an aside question. Since you are an avid reader of historical fiction, do you have another writer of the diaspora who's doing historical fiction that you'd like to recommend?
Oh, yes, 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 yes. The
Yes.
person who, I mean, I could have a long list.
Yes.
The person that I acknowledge as definitely someone who has inspired me absolutely is Edric Dandicat, who is a Haitian American writer.
Yes.
Yes. And her book, The Farming of Bones, was the first historical fiction rendering of the 1937 massacre of Haitian sugarcane workers under Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic in 1937, where in October 1937, the president, or the dictator, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, ordered the massacre of cane workers, and approximately 15,000 Haitians were killed in 1 week. And it's also known as the Parsley
Wow.
Massacre or El Corto, which is the cutting, because what Trujillo did was he had the soldiers not use bullets. He had them use machetes or machetes, as to signify that it was the peasants who were the local farmers who were killing these Haitians, but in actuality it was his army. And so for me, even though that story is deeply steeped in history, deeply steeped in oppression and pain, the way that she makes the characters stand out. Like my favorite line is the first sentence of the book. His name was Sebastian Onius. And for me, that opened a world because here was this cane worker, this Black Haitian man, this beautiful Black Haitian man,
I love how you
who
were
is
like,
the
it's beautiful.
Yes, 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 because that deeply informed the way that I even wrote my main male character.
Wow. Nice. Because I had to take a moment to like acknowledge it when you were like, the beautiful. Because that's the other reason too why this book is so beautiful, is because of the male protagonist. Which it's interesting. Last week, yeah, I've been doing these back to back. Last week's author, children's picture book author, Desiree Cooper, rendered a grandfather and his grandson, and it's like I'm seeing it's so rare to see male figures enjoy, and
Mhm.
so I'm like, oh, cannot wait to get to those questions. So this goes back to something that I mentioned earlier. One of the narratives in Finding La Grajita centers around a coming of age story during the 1800s, at a time when folks of African descent and from Africa who were enslaved in the New World. I do not believe I have yet to read a story from this perspective, a coming of age story, as coming of age stories are my favorite. I teach them in my courses. Can you talk about why you made this particular choice in terms of the coming of age story? Because there's several narratives throughout dealing with this multi-generational family. Can you talk about why you made the particular choice of including a coming of age story and how it would look different than the coming of age story set further in history, like now, even before the Black liberation movements?
Okay. I have to say that I was definitely inspired, and everybody should write this down,
Mhm.
by the young adult novel called Willow, and it's also historical fiction. It's written by Tanya Cherie Hegeman, who is a
Can you spell the last name? Because I'm going to type it for
yes. So it's
people.
Tanya, Tonya, middle name Cherie, Cherie, and the surname is Hegamin. Tanya Cherie Hegeman, and her book Willow is historical fiction, and it's a coming of age story. It's a young adult story
Ooh.
about 15-year-old Willow, who's an enslaved girl who lives in Maryland and is on a plantation but knows how to read and write and has to grapple, right? And has a father who is very much invested, who's also enslaved, but very invested in slavery in order to keep his
Oh.
family together. And so, in thinking about a coming of age story, I actually didn't do that intentionally, meaning I didn't set
Oh.
out to write that. What happened was originally this book was written with four point of views. So it was Dakari, who is the main male protagonist, then Esmeralda, who I just read, who was the enslaved woman from the church, owned by the church. Then
Mhm.
Michaela, who is an enslaved woman who is Dakari's love interest. And
Yeah.
then Jendai, and that's Jendai is the 15-year-old who is Dakari's daughter.
Mhm.
And that it's really her coming of age story that we follow. So originally I had written in with literally four I point of views. And then in discussions with my editor, we changed it so that everything was written in the third person except Esmeralda. And
Oh,
Esmeralda
wow.
basically is the one because she moved from the church into La Gotera and she moves through different spaces. She's also someone who is an informant. She knows how to read and write.
Yep.
Um, and so she is someone who gives the news and is someone very much cared for by the free Black community, even though she's enslaved. And so for me, it made sense that Jendai was trying to figure out for herself the relationship that she has with her father, because for the first 7 years, she's raised without her father by the local free Black community because he's enslaved. Her mother dies giving birth to her on the slave ship coming over. And so she has to kind of grapple with this relationship of identity and trying to figure out a new relationship with her dad once he gains his freedom and he comes back to raise her. And then she's also young. She has hormones. She has all these things that she's trying to figure out. Um, and she's never really questioned them before until certain things happen where she has to look at the world around her with different eyes.
Mhm.
And in the process, I think the thing that really allows her to evolve in terms of coming of age, in the process, what happens is she develops a relationship, an ancestral relationship with her mother who has passed, and she develops a relationship with Esmeralda, who in many ways takes her under her wing and mentors her. And I wouldn't mothers her, but almost grandmothers her, right?
Yeah,
Because Esmeralda's older. So I would say those relationships allow her to grow. I mean, with her father as well, but really with Esmeralda, and then her spiritual sense of self. And that is how she comes of age in this book.
nice. And the other thing I love about Esmeralda as a character is just the fact that she is delivering from first person, because at least for me, in my experience with religion in the church, which is why I'm not involved now, I grew up Southern Baptist and Episcopalian, is women are, in my experience, are not allowed to have a voice or hold leadership positions. So for her, that's what I was rendering, reading her perspective from first person. I was like, yes, like, thank you for constructing that particular narrative, because it does give power to someone who was disempowered by the church.
Absolutely. And she
Mhm.
has a lot of power.
Yes.
No
So much
spoilers.
so. No spoilers. Yeah, and people, please, please get the book. Like, I wrote these questions to where they'll give you just enough information to buy the book. Please buy the book. Um, so Finding La Negrita, similarly to other texts that have been discussed on Black Writers Read, centers around a multi-generational story. Why do you think it's important to render a multi-generational story and a narrative around this particular time period and horrific moment in diasporic history?
Yeah, thank you. So it's multi-generational because what people don't understand, well, or maybe what people don't really get, is the fact that slavery was multi-generation in terms of its impact and legacy,
Yeah.
right? So it wasn't just the person working in the field or in the house, but it was everybody around them, the children, and everybody had to negotiate those relationships. And so for me, it was really important to show the effects of the father, and the effects of the child, and the effects of how the elders play, all parts of this as they experience the tenuous ideas around freedom, or they experience enslavement, right? In relation to the Spanish colonists that were in Cartago at this time period. So it's about broadening, I guess, broadening the palette for me to show not just one perspective, but to show that it affected everyone, and in ways that were very, very serious, right? And those things either can stop in terms of traumas, right?
Yeah.
If you acknowledge them, or they will continue with future generations. And I think that that's something that I wanted to grapple with in the book.
Yeah. And also, too, the other reason why I think the multi-generational story is so important. So briefly, so Natasha and I talked a little bit about this beforehand, but I want to briefly mention, and I think I mentioned on past episodes, that I recently, well, my father, before he passed, started it. And I have other members of my family who did. And I picked up on finishing our family tree. Given that I am 90+% of the African continent, DNA wise, my ancestry is deep, multiple generations in the United States. On both my mother and father's side of the family, we can only go as far back as like the early to mid 1800s, excuse me, because that's where we find my first enslaved ancestor. And in the United States, up until a certain point, those who were enslaved, in terms of the census, were marked as property and not as people. And so for me, the multi generational story, the narrative around this time period is so important because it acknowledges the humanity of our people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's deep. I'm like, it's so deep. So I kind of want to go into the characters for a little bit. So I'd like
Yeah.
to talk about the central character, Dakari, who was once a famed African sculptor who was stolen into slavery. First off, I'd like to name the power in gifting a character such a rich backstory, one that is a clear departure I think, from many other cultural products. So, like books, films. This is one of the reasons why I stay away from a lot of films, like recent films about slavery. One, because I'm tired of watching us getting beat, and that's it. Um, about those of African descent who were enslaved. They had a particular life before their humanity was stolen. Can you talk about why this particular character to curate a story of finding La Negrita, and why it is a male character? Because many stories that I've had access to around this genre and around this time period, there's a woman leading the story. And prior to responding to this question, I also like to say that there is power in rendering a male protagonist, as I rarely see one written so richly. And again, in other episodes of Black Writers Read, I featured women writers whose main characters have been men.
So Dakara is a gift. And I will go back to just thinking about how impacted I was by Edwidge Dandycat's book, The Farming of Bones, and thinking about her main male character, Sebastian Onius. And Sebastian, even though it's written from the point of view of Amabel Desir, who is writing from the first person, so we never get inside of Sebastian's head, right? But he is this cane worker, and I just thought, oh, when I read this, I was just like, the author must have an incredible relationship with the Black men in her life, because even though, you know, it's a time of oppression, this is someone who has been loved and cared for by Black men, because in the way that she presents the humanity of these Black men, of Sebastian and other Black men, I just thought, oh yeah, I understand that these are community men. These are men who are also fragile and loving in the midst of oppression. Yeah. And so Dakara was the first character. And I want to just pause for a second. None of these characters that I created are composites of people that I know, right? These are all characters that just showed up. They had their own voice. They were just like, this is a story we got to tell. Yes. So Dakara was the first character, and I loved him from the beginning. I was like, oh no, he is a beautiful man. He shows up, and it's interesting because, you know, I read a little bit to my husband, and he was just like, you know, most men are flawed. Like, you're painting this really beautiful picture of this man. And I was just like, yeah, you're right. So I needed to make him more complex. And his voice was really easy because his voice just showed up on the page. Literally, I was just typing and he was like, let me tell you about this. And then it gets complex. And so, like, when my husband read it again, he was like, oh yeah, that's right. That's accurate. And I just thought, okay. And so everybody else sort of in relation to Dakara made sense because they all had relationships to him in some ways, because he was the first character to show up. And then Esmeralda and Jendai, and then in the end, Michaela. But for me, in writing this male, it just, he just showed up. So it just made sense. He is someone who carried me through this whole process. I grew with him. I was very much, I love this character. It was very, you know, and when I closed the book and ended it, it was very hard to like say goodbye to all of them. But I felt like he had done justice to the, you know, and then helped me do justice to the story that he wanted to tell. And I wanted to tell a story about a loving, complex Black man who had a whole story. So he is this sculptor from Zimbabwe who is carving these Shona statues. I've been to Zimbabwe. I have talked to artists who are carving these statues. None of this was make-believe. I've been in these spaces. Wow. You know, I lived in South Africa. I did my PhD in South Africa. So my husband and I, we were in Zimbabwe in the 90s. We engaged with artists who, you know, also spent time with their kids. So all of these carvings, thinking about the stones, all this stuff, it's authentic because I've actually had this experience. Like all those spaces, the language, the speak people spoke. It wasn't hard for me. I mean, obviously I had to fact check, but I mean, it wasn't hard for me because I know Zimbabweans, and I mean, I've been in these spaces. Like I don't have to dream it. I've been there, and so it made sense for Dakarai to be from Zimbabwe, to think about. Going to the market in Angola, which is where he is ultimately taken into
Yeah.
the Portuguese slave trade with his wife. And so it made sense because there's this marketplace, and they take their sculptures and they go every during different seasons to then sell it at market, right? And they're famed for their artwork and their skill, and that is how he's actually able to make a living and even buy his own freedom once he's enslaved in Costa Rica, because he basically can do all this carving. And Costa Rica has a lot of wood, and so he becomes this carpenter, and that's essentially his identity. And then in thinking about sort of multi-generational moments, Jendai has also been blessed with the skill of sculpting, but
Yep.
but because of the trauma of his experience of enslavement, about losing his wife, about leaving home, having his wife die on the slave ship, he does not want her to continue on that path. And it's only through sort of a reckoning as they both mature towards the end of the book that they resolve certain things around sculpting.
Mhm. Oh, everybody, please buy the book. And by the way, I gotta throw Gardens of Roses to your imagination, because, like, I know for myself, whenever I write, it's typically composites of people that I know. And so just to hear that you were like, oh, he emerged from the page, I'm like,
Yeah.
that, like, yeah, you were born to be doing this. You were called to be
Thank
writing
you.
fiction. Like, that is definitely, that is such a gift. So now on to his daughter, Jendai. Why her as a central character in the book? And then why this unique rendering of their relationship?
Yeah. I think I needed Dakarai to figure out excuse me, figure out his relationship with women, right? And
Mm.
so and because obviously there's a deeper story, from because I do take us back to Zimbabwe, right? The prologue starts in Zimbabwe, in Angola, actually. And so there are moments where he does give backstory eventually to his time at home before he was enslaved, and that identity that he has for himself. I wanted him to kind of work through some of the issues that he had with women. And I think that he's able to kind of find a reckoning or a space and see his own limitations and flaws through his relationship with his daughter. Right. And
Wow.
also differently than his relationship with Michaela, who becomes his love interest. But I really wanted that moment where he has to figure out his own failings as a father, and then the things that he actually is successful with, because that is human,
Yeah.
right? And it's only actually through Jendai kind of pushing him to be more included. That's when, in his life and what's happening, there's all these rumors in town. I mean, it's a bit of a scandal. She's sort of left out of the dark, really protected, and he can't. It takes him a while to get to the space where it's like, no, she's not a baby anymore. She's
Yeah.
this 15-year-old in the world. And she makes some
Wow.
decisions that are also, kind of tough, that her dad definitely would not approve of,
Yep.
but she has to follow her own heart. And in many ways, I wanted to kind of include an abolitionist kind of
Yes.
undergirding in there. But you got to read the book in order to get that
Yes.
part.
We're trying so hard not to give the book away so you can buy it. And
Exactly.
I think it's like $17 right now on Bookshop, just saying.
Yes, and it's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. I mean, yeah, it's everywhere.
Yes. I have a couple more questions before we wrap up today.
Sure.
So since I saw that she came on, I'm gonna skip to the question of Lisa, with Lisa Pegram in the question. Hopefully she is still on. So the book was published by Jaded Ibis Press. which I want to give a shout out to Lisa, and she is both with Levee Break Lit, which is the literary publicity company that you are a client of, and Jaded Ibis Press. You have a very special relationship with this publisher, which is so beautiful. Can you talk about this relationship and why it was important that Jaded Ibis Press was the company that acquired Finding La Negrita?
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, what I even want to do is provide a caveat to say I have a very special relationship with Lisa. Um, so
Oh,
Lisa is the acquisitions editor at Jaded Ibis. And so I would say that once I had the first draft of the book, I spent about 2 years trying to get someone interested in it. And it was actually a really tough time, and I shout out to all the writers who persevere. And I felt like I had a singular story because no one was writing in English or Spanish about this period in colonial Costa Rica. People were like, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico? Like, I mean, yes, I still get that,
wow.
right? And just like slavery, Costa Rica, Black people, like there was no place. So I understood that this book in many ways was joining a bigger conversation about Afro-Latinidad, about, visibility. And so I was persistent, but I have to say, I sent out query letter after query letter. People were not interested. I was trying to find an agent.
Wow.
At one point, there was a literary agency that was sort of interested, and then they strung me along, and it felt really bad. And then months later, at the end, they were like, "No, we're going to pass," And after meetings and
Wow.
revisions, and so I have to say, one night, what I did was actually after that experience, excuse me, I got on Facebook, and in one of the private groups, I think it was like writers of color looking for agents, literary agents or something. And so I said,
Wow.
I kind of wrote, and it was really late at night. I was in bed, literally in the dark on my phone, and I felt so sad because I had just been turned down and thinking that I was actually progressing, but I had been turned down. And so I just thought, okay. So I wrote kind of a little summary. I didn't name any names or anything, but I was just like, I'd like some advice on how to go forward. I've just spent like 6 months with these people, done multiple revisions, and they basically just said no, goodbye. And I got a message privately from Lisa, who was like,
Oh,
and it was like midnight. And I remember this distinctly. She was just like, I'm really sorry that you had this experience. I would, from what you've written about your book, I'd love to take a look at it. I'm an acquisitions editor for Jaded Ibis. And she read it, and there we go. And then the experience has just been like
right.
incredible. Lisa has been a fantastic, sister, and supporter of my work. And one of the things that I admire most about her is that she held the integrity of my word, meaning that
Right.
on the page, she really allowed the word to stand as I created it. And there weren't many changes. I mean, there was grammar things and everything, but in terms of like the integrity of the characters and how they showed up on the page and the story, and she helped me kind of fix the ending because there were a bunch of different things that we were thinking about, but how to resolve the ending. And she guided me with that. And I'm just really appreciative because it's really my relationship with Lisa that has allowed me
Oh,
to create, to have this book in hand. And I live in Costa Rica, and the book is published in the US. And so, in thinking about sort of a US audience, I had a beautiful book launch sponsored and hosted by the Brooklyn Museum of Art. It was
yeah.
massive, beautiful. So many people showed up, and I was really grateful for that kind of support. And then now the publicity company has, booked me with many events, and the support has been unending, and I'm just grateful for it because not everybody has that support, particularly
Yeah.
when you're working with a small independent press.
Yeah, and Lisa, like, to throw more flowers her way, because I've had a lot of her writers on, and they all talked about, either on camera or with me privately, about the beauty and her respect for their word. So it's like, I'm not going to change your story so that it's for an audience, I'm gonna keep the integrity and the audience will find you. Like it's
Yeah.
just it's so beautiful working with her, which is also why I'm so excited to have her on in January so that she can talk about her own work because she
Yeah.
is also such a very prolific writer and just the doors that she opens for people. So something else too, Natasha, that I did and researching for you, I realized in the barely 2 months since your book has been out, you have been getting interviews like that. And I'm like, yes, and that's all because of Lisa's work. Like she is phenomenal.
She is phenomenal. Yes, I'm very lucky to have her on my team.
Yeah. Then I have a couple more questions. So the cover of the book, I really want to talk about it because one of the
Hmm.
things that we did on social media when the date of the book was coming out, we posted about the book cover. So, can you talk about working with the designer? How were they identified, and just the process of getting that very beautifully evocative cover?
So this is a story.
Yes, I love the
So
story.
this is a story. So when my husband and I and the kids landed here June 2014, right? Yes.
Wow.
So right in the beginning, we came during, it was June, so it was summer holidays, right? The summer holidays started. And so
Yeah.
I put it, I think, on Facebook, like, hi, I'm here in Costa Rica. I'm really interested in learning about colonial Costa Rica and Cartago and the Black Madonna, right? Because I wanted to jump into the research. And so this woman, Maria Batista, and I love her, she was like, randomly, Costa Rican, was like, I live in Cartago. If you come and meet us, I will show you around. And so she did. She took us around, where the different areas and the churches and everything. We went to the basilica. And then once we left her and her husband, and we were just walking around the town. And of course, we're New Yorkers. So what do New Yorkers do? If we see a museum, we see a gallery, we go in. And so there was the
Yes.
municipal, right? I mean, so we're cultured that way. And so there was the Municipal Museum of Cartago was there and it was open. So we just kind of strolled in. There was nobody there. Maybe there was a guard walking around. There was nobody in the space.
Mm.
And there were like maps and, about the history. And then we walked into this back room. And let me tell you, there on the back wall, that was like a monster wall, was the entire colonial history as a mural of Costa Rica. It was an actual mural.
Wow.
And yes, and I mean, it's unbelievable. So I walk up to one of the sections, this, and I start taking
Wow.
photographs because there is the Black Madonna. There
Yep.
she is, right? And then all of a sudden, they're the Catholic Church, they're the Catholic priest.
Yep.
There's the mother and child, Jendai and her mother. And then here is our angel who I perceived
Yeah.
as Esmeralda. And so we took a bunch of pictures. And Guadalupe Alvaros Rojas is the muralist. She's a Costa Rican. And I
Wow.
took these pictures and then, I was so impressed by this. I was just like, I've never actually seen in Costa Rican history, Black people actually
Yes.
rendered into authentic colonial history. I had never seen that before. But anyway, we took a bunch of pictures and then walked away. And then fast forward, maybe last January, Jaded Ibis says, okay, well, we need to start looking for book covers, so maybe pull a couple of books off your shelf that you like in some ways and we'll figure it out. And so I pulled a couple of things off my shelf and there was one image that I liked. And then I went to my husband, Masauko, and I was like, what do you think about that? He's like, no. He's like, why don't you use the mural? And I was like, what mural?
What?
I didn't remember that. And so I was like, oh, the
Oh. Oh,
mural, the mural.
mural.
And so I was like, oh gosh, those images are on my BlackBerry,
You
right?
said
So I had
BlackBerry.
a la Obama. And I was
Yes.
like, I went and plugged in the BlackBerry and I was like, Lord, please let it turn on. And there
Yes.
were the pictures on the BlackBerry, about 100 of them. And so what I did
Wow.
was I wrote to the artist and I was just like, so this is who I am. This is the story of my book. Could I use this image? And she was like, absolutely. And then the press, I reached out to the press and I was like, so here's the image that I want. And can we set up a contract with the artist? And she was like, absolutely. So the press did that. But then my
Wow.
husband, who's a very smart man, who
Yes.
worked for a museum for 8 years, was like, it's actually the property of the museum. You're going to have to get permission from the museum.
Oh,
Not, I was like, oh my God, you're right. And so I had to then reach out to the museum and
yeah.
they were like, you can have it, but you got to get permission from the mayor.
What? What?
Yes. So then I had to write the mayor, and then the mayor's legal team and I then had to negotiate to get formal permission. And so I finally got that after months and months, and I was able to send all the legal documents with the approval to the press. And then here's the cover. So if you come to the Municipal Museum in Cartago, you will actually see an entire a
Wow.
mural of the entire colonial history of Costa Rica. And this image actually is about maybe the size of my head. It's not, it's
It's not
actually
that
quite,
big?
it's not that huge. No, not at all. You know, and my
Wow.
sister and my husband and my brother, my sister and brother were visiting Costa Rica from New York, and they went one day. My sister's a professional photographer, and they went and actually snapped the pictures for the dimensions that the press needed in order to actually render the cover. And so I need to give them a shout out as well, my sister and brother.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the story of the cover.
I love how it's like this interesting version of like as you were going through the people, I'm like, this takes me to like, the 12 days of Christmas, but it's dealing with the steps. Be like, on the fourth step of acquiring this image, we had to talk to so and so. Be like,
Right.
and it
It
just
was a
kept
journey.
wow, and it just kept going. And two, and like as you were talking, I'm like, because I worked in a museum one summer, and as you were mentioning the steps, I'm like, oh, yep. And then you were like the mayor, oh, because it was in a public museum, and oh, yep. But I'm so
Yeah.
glad it actually happened. How, like, what was the time frame? How long did it take?
Probably about maybe 4 months.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. And I had to constantly get back to maybe a little bit longer, but I had to constantly write. I mean, getting to the artist, once I connected with her, she was so
Yeah.
gracious and her work is amazing.
Oh.
But it was really the other sort of bureaucracies, the other formalities.
I can imagine. I can so imagine. Excuse me. We're both coughing. I'm like, gotta love this time of year. So I want to end with a couple of questions specifically about your career as a writer. You have such a prolific career as a scholar, cultural critic, and professor. How has your writing style and literary voice evolved since writing your first book, Representation in Black Womanhood: The Legacy of Sarah Bartman, in 2011? And in your response, can you also include how you began writing for magazines like Essence? I must say that I highly admire your diverse contributions to the culture, and I also hope to follow in your footsteps. I'm putting it out there.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I mean, I have to say, when I was 5 years old, I was asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I wanted to be a writer. And so it's taken me 40 plus years, more than 40 plus years, to get back around to do this. So I'm trained, obviously, academically. And so the Sarah Bartman book, where some people may know her as the Hottentot Venus,
Yes.
is something that it's a project that was a labor of love, but it also established my academic presence because I was in South Africa. And what I did was I wanted people to think about Sarah Bartman as this enslaved woman who was then taken to England and France and put on a stage until she was dissected and put in the Museum of Man in France with her genitals and her brains and everything, on display until she was returned to South Africa in 2002. I wanted people to think about Sarah Bartman as this enslaved person, but with an ethic of care. And that for me, in thinking about slavery in general, it was just about, well, how do we get into the interior, into the agency that enslaved people actuated, because they had to. They got up every day, and that's an active agency in terms of just existing in such an oppressive system, in such a violent system. And so, in thinking about Sarah Bartman, that was sort of, I wrote my dissertation on her. And so this book really comes out of the dissertation. But what I did was I invited South African scholars, particularly who were writing from a South African lens, to
Mhm.
write about Sarah Bartman because they did it with an ethic of care, right? So it was a very curated process. And I have to say that book has done very well. It's, part of the required reading in universities in South Africa. It
Wow.
is, yes, it has done very, very well in honoring Sarah Bartman, right? And then I guess for me, it wasn't a big jump to think about these enslaved people in colonial Costa Rica, because in many cases, these were all people who were on ships and taken from home into a place that was new and then had to create identities. So
Mhm.
it didn't matter where you were, but it really depended on how you were going to navigate freedom and enslavement. And so, excuse me, when I got to Costa Rica, what happened? I was invited to write this piece on moving to Costa Rica with taking my family, right? And I had really just been writing academically, right? And publishing academically. And so it was really my first time in creative nonfiction, but I wrote this piece in essence, and it was sort of like the shot heard around the world. And so I literally, like my teaching job, somebody read it at the university that I teach at, read it and invited me to speak about it. And that's how I got my teaching job, and then
Oh.
somebody from the Tico Times read it and invited me to then have a monthly column called Musings from an Afro-Costa Rican. And what I did for 4 years, yeah, I wrote for 4 years. I basically decided to like hold up Blackness in Costa Rica. So I basically reached out to a ton of people, from hip hop artists to writers to just different people all over, lawyers and activists who were Afro descendant, and basically had conversations with them about their lives and about experiencing, being a Black person in Costa Rica. And then also some of the historical research that I've done in preparation for this book. I also wrote about the Black Madonna and colonial Cartago. And then one of the last pieces that I really loved and I'm so proud of, I did a Black hair series where I
Oh.
Yes, where I interviewed all these Black women, and I didn't even know that they were here. But there was this collective of Black women, and I interviewed them, got pictures of their hair, and then talked about their experience. Right, most of them, when I spoke to them, had natural hair at that time period, but they had all had experiences with the alisette, which is the straightening, the
Oh,
perm
yeah.
stuff. And so in growing up and thinking about respectability politics and Blackness and engaging with the church and what the elders are saying. So I did a 3-part series on the hair, and I loved that piece.
Wow.
And then another piece that I really loved, excuse me, was I wrote a piece on my great grandmother Ruth Gruzon in the 1940s on the Caribbean coast of Puerto Limon, and about how she was the sole proprietor for a hotel, a segregated hotel. Even as a Black Jamaican woman, she was the proprietor for this hotel. And so what the Tico Times ran the piece, like it came out, I don't know, in 2016 or whatever, but they ran the
Oh.
piece about it maybe about a year and a half ago again. And I didn't know that. So I woke up in the morning and I get an email from the former president of Costa Rica, Guillermo Soles, in my email. And I'm like pulling my husband, like, can you look at this email? Look at
Yes.
I know. I was just like, oh my gosh. And he wrote me this beautiful message just saying that his mother and aunt were also from this community, and he considers himself Afro descendant, and that he just really appreciated my writing. And so I was just so honored about that. And so in terms of the evolution of my writing, I do not really create academic. I don't need to write academically anymore. It's not something that I really enjoy.
Yes.
I enjoy writing historical fiction. I love doing research. I'm formally trained to do that.
Yep.
But there's also something about creativity, right? And the imagination and allowing these characters to show up. And so I am firmly based as a historical fiction writer. I definitely don't do Afrofuturism. I'm not going to do a young adult or children's. Well, maybe I could do a children's book at some point,
Aw.
but I love historical fiction because I like actually doing the work of the research.
Nice. Like I feel like when you were talking about your liberation and your freedom, I'm just imagining like the Harriet Tubman of literature coming to free you, be like, my sister, it's time for you to move away from academia, which is a whole thing.
Mhm.
So a question just came through from a regular viewer, and I wanted to pose it right now before we wrapped up because it's such a great question. So she writes, and she's a fellow writer, artist, professor based in Western Mass. If you wrote a book in Spanish, what would it be about? So like the book is fully in the Spanish language.
That's really interesting. One,
Hmm.
I am not fully fluent in Spanish, so I would not be able to write a book in Spanish.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, I know that I want this, and I have somebody already who's agreed to it. I'd like this book to be translated into Spanish, but I think
Oh,
the reception in Costa Rica is going to be, it'll be a bit tricky, right? I think
mhm.
that I'm not kind to the Catholic Church, right?
Oh
Even though
well.
my portrayal is authentic,
Yep.
the archives confirm it. So yes, I think that there will be people who will not necessarily be as receptive as other people in the world. And that wasn't the point of this book. The point of this book wasn't necessarily just finding a Costa Rican audience, even though, of course, I welcome a Costa Rican audience, an English speaking or English reading Costa Rican audience. But I'm really thinking about this book as sort of a placeholder for the bigger conversation about the Black Atlantic and thinking about enslaved
Oh,
people in this region, right? That's what I'm really interested in. Like the idea of
wow.
that these people didn't exist, that in Latin America there were no people of African descent. Of course there were. How were these cities built? On black labor, right?
Yep.
All the way from Central America to South America. I mean, come on, or indigenous labor, or a mix thereof. And
Yeah.
so that's why I wanted to. That's why I think that this book, excuse me, it serves its purpose in English for me.
Mm.
Because I'm thinking about the world, right? So I'm thinking about a Caribbean writer reading this. I'm thinking about,
Oh.
people in the UK reading this. I'm thinking about even Afro Latinos in other spaces who may also battle with invisibility.
Wow. Yeah, you need to come to Western Mass because there's a very unique community there. And lastly, I want to close with how can we, the Black Writers Read community, now that you're an official member, support you on your journey?
Buy the book and read
Yeah.
it and post about it. I mean, I'm really lucky that I have a great publicity team, but a lot of the
Mhm.
work that I have to do is basically, creating relationships and asking people to read it. So it's not just about buying the book and then putting it on the shelf, but it's also about reading it because that's how a book lives, right? So read it, discuss it. I'm more than happy
Yes.
to enter classrooms via Zoom. You know, I am
Yes.
more than, happy to engage, but I love when people actually read the book and then we can get actually into the text. I mean, that's what I teach, right? So I would
Close
love to be like
reading.
on page, let's do a close reading. Let's do a deep dive. Let's look at these choices that these characters are making. Let's look at these themes. That's what I'm more than happy to do. And so, yeah, so it's about, and then also, if folks are reading the book and buying the book and they enjoy it, post it on social media, tag me on Instagram. It's just
Yep.
my name,
I'm about to bring
that's,
it up.
yeah,
Boom.
that's what I would really, really like. I'd really appreciate, because it all counts. It matters.
Mhm. And then also too, so I'm, calling myself to the carpet. So one of the goals that I have for Black Writers Read is creating a virtual book club where we can read the books by our authors. And over the summers when Black Writers Read is a little dormant, and would you like to be since
Yes.
yeah, yes, you I didn't even have to ask the question.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So to put some respect on your name, before we wrap up, Dr. Natasha Gordon-Chipembere, thank you so. This was such an amazing conversation. Like as always, these are master classes for me. Selfishly, I'm like, yeah, I just invite audiences to come to my conversation because I learned so much about like the craft and publishing, and like it's helping me because like I was telling people previously, I have not been writing for a while, like over a year creatively because I've been working on my dissertation, but I'm like I need to stay in the work, and so for me this is an MFA for me. This series.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a beautiful platform. I'm so
Thank
excited
you.
to be part of this community. And thank you for welcoming me in and for reading my book and asking these incredible questions. Thank you. I appreciate
Oh,
it.
thank you so much. So I'm gonna take you off screen, and I have a little bit of things to wrap up. So Natasha, thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Thank you. So, thanks to everyone joining us today. I will be back on Saturday, December 3rd, with Tony Ann Johnson. We'll be talking about her latest book, Light Skin Gone to Waste, which received the 2021 Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction and significant praise and support from Roxane Gay. I will be sharing, she did an interview with Roxane Gay about her book not too long ago. Find me and more about Black Writers Read on my website at NicoleMYoung.com. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel to keep up with episodes of both Black Writers Read and my other projects because I do the most. And please be sure to subscribe to the audio podcast because what I do to make this work accessible, I actually take the audio from the live stream and a couple of weeks later, I post it as an audio podcast. And that is available Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This was such a great conversation and also such a great audience. And more importantly, thank you so much for continuing to ensure that Black writers continue to matter. Have a great afternoon.